This documentary looks at the life of the infamous lady-in-waiting at the Tudor court, Jane Boleyn. Jane Boleyn, also known as the Viscountess or Lady Rochford, would serve for 5 of Henry VIII's queens and wives. She was also through marriage to George Boleyn, the sister-in-law to Henry VIII's second wife and Queen Anne Boleyn. Jane Boleyn was born Jane Parker in around 1505 in the English county of Norfolk. Her father was Henry Parker, 10th Baron Morley, and her mother Alice St. John. Alice St. John was the great-granddaughter of Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. Margaret was the mother of Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII through her marriage to Edmund Tudor, 1st Earl of Richmond. This blood link would make Jane a distant relative of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Queen Mary and Elizabeth I. She would also be through her marriage to George Boleyn, brother of Anne Boleyn, the aunt of Elizabeth I. Being by blood connected to the royal family, she was sent to King Henry VIII's royal court at an early age to become part of the household of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. It has been recorded that Jane was in attendance at the summit meeting between King Henry VIII of England and King Francis I of France in 1520, known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold at Balingham, in English-controlled northern France. As a young lady at King Henry's court, she would take part in many events as an actress or a dancer to entertain the king, including the Chateau Vert Masquerade in 1552, where she would perform alongside her future sisters-in-law, Anne and Mary Boleyn. Jane would eventually meet George Boleyn at Henry's court. No doubt George was rising through the ranks at court due to the rising influence of his father and sister in the king's favour. Jane would marry George during the winter of 1524–25. This would be before Anne had become the king's lover, wife and queen. King Henry would gift the 2 members of his court as a wedding present Grimston Manor, in the village of Grimston in Norfolk. In 1526, King Henry would begin his relationship with Anne Boleyn, although Anne refused to any sexual relationship with the king until his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was dissolved. Coinciding with Anne's relationship with the king, would see the rest of her family's fortunes increase as well. Jane's husband would become Viscount Rochford, which in turn made her Viscountess Rochford in 1529, although Jane would be known at court as Lady Rochford. The couple would then be gifted the luxurious residence of the Palace of Beaulieu, near the English town of Boreham in Essex in the early 1530s, although there is no record of the deeds being officially signed over to George. After King Henry had failed in his pursuit of the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon for Pope Clement VII, he and Thomas Cromwell would break up the Catholic Church in England and start the conversion of the kingdom to a Protestant state. With his newfound power as the head of church in England, Henry was able to annul his marriage to Catherine and secretly wed Anne Boleyn on the 25th of January 1553. The marriage would make Jane sister-in-law to both the King and Queen of England. Not much is known or recorded of Jane's relationship with either Anne Boleyn or her sister Mary during their time at court. All that is known is that in 1534, Henry would banish the Viscountess from court. When it was uncovered, she was involved in a plot with the Queen to remove one of the King's mistresses from court. Jane's husband, George, would be arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London in May 1536. The alleged charges were for having sexual intercourse with his sister, Anne, Queen of England. The charges were never proved, but were created by the Boleyns' enemies at court and were brought to a head by the Countess of Worcester. The only role Jane would have at her husband's trial was to be asked if she knew of any issues between the King and Queen's sexual relationship in their marriage. Part 2 of the documentary will look at the fallout from the downfall of the Boleyn family and Jane's later life at court. The execution of Jane's husband, George Boleyn, took place on the 17th of May 1530. He was beheaded at Tower Hill with 4 other men, including Mark Smeaton, who had been tortured into making a confession. Anne Boleyn was executed by beheading 2 days later on the 19th of May. She was executed by a French swordsman who was personally sent for by Henry VIII from Calais. It has never been documented if Jane attended either of the executions. Following the downfall of Anne and George Boleyn, all the land Anne had acquired during her reign as queen. George's death also meant that without a male heir all of his fortune and property was also forfeit. Jane, though, would retain the title of Viscountess Rochford. She would also initially remain absent from court whilst negotiating a financial future from the King's minister, Thomas Cromwell, and also her father-in-law Sir Thomas Boleyn. She would eventually secure a pension for 100, although this was not equal to her income when married to George Boleyn. Within a year of her husband's death, her financial situation was enough to return to court as a lady-in-waiting to the new queen, Jane Seymour, and was continued to be known as Lady Rochford. In 1537, Jane Seymour would pass away after childbirth. After Jane Seymour's death, it is unsure what Jane Boleyn's role at court was, but she would return as a lady-in-waiting for Henry VIII's new queen, Anne of Cleves. It was Jane's testimony that Anne had confided in her that her marriage to Henry had not been consummated, which allowed Henry VIII to annul his marriage to Anne. It was also widely known at this time that Henry's wandering eye had caught the attention of the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, Catherine Howard. When Henry eventually married Catherine Howard, Jane would keep her role as lady-in-waiting for the new queen. Later in 1540, rumors about Catherine's previous relationships before her marriage to the king surfaced at court. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, would be appointed to lead the investigation. Whilst Catherine Howard was under house arrest at Syon Abbey in Middlesex, it was then discovered that Lady Rochford had been arranging secret meetings between Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper, a royal courtier and friend of Henry VIII. Whilst in imprisonment in the Tower of London in 1542, Jane would be continually interrogated for month after month but was never reportedly tortured. Such was the intensity of the interrogation it led to Jane have a nervous breakdown and being declared insane. At this time in England, it was against the law for a person who is insane to stand trial. But in his anger, Henry VIII would change the laws to ensure that people who were insane could be tried and executed for high treason. Jane would be sentenced to death on the same day as Catherine Howard, the 13th of February 1542. On the day of execution, at Tower Hill, Catherine Howard was executed first. Then Jane would be led from the tower to be executed shortly after. Her manner on the day was described as calm and dignified. It was reported that Jane Boleyn was killed with a one blow from the axe. She was reportedly 36 years old. She would be buried in the Tower of London, close to her relatives, her husband George Boleyn and her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn. Also buried beside her would be her last queen, Catherine Howard. Jane's marriage to George Boleyn has been contradicted throughout history, with some historians seemingly believing that they had a happy marriage whilst others believe that Jane was a wicked woman who plotted the downfall of both her husband and sister-in-law. Jane and George, though, would both die without any children.